When we have 100 to 125 yards from the fairway, how close should we be hitting it to the hole? Where should our expectations be? Let's tee it up.
Welcome to Data Access Golf, your home for rapid golf improvement. And now, from the thin air of the Rocky Mountains, next on the number one tee, your host, Aaron Stewart.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Data Access Golf, the podcast. Great to have you along today. So we are continuing our series on data that matters, or data matters. So looking at data to try to determine if we can create some realistic expectations for our game in creating goals that will help us get better in 2019 and keep us from getting too frustrated out on the golf course when we expect way too much out of ourselves because we really don't know what to expect. I think sometimes we as amateur golfers expect way more out of ourselves than we can actually perform and that we should expect to perform. Last show we talked about driving accuracy and we discussed how the very best on the PGA Tour hits the fairway about 75% of the time, and that was Henrik Stenson. We also talked about the average of that was hitting the fairways about 8 out of 14 fairways, 62% of the time. So that is what we're going to set up as our benchmark. Our goal will be, hey, let's try to hit 8 out of 14 fairways. So that means that our expectation would be that we're going to miss 6 fairways. If our driving accuracy drops below that 62%, say we're only hitting 6 fairways or 5 fairways around, then we know we need to put in some practice on our long game. So we're going to use these benchmarks and we're going to use the data to help us determine realistic benchmarks so then we will know what we should work on our game. We have limited time to practice. So we're going to use actual data from the PGA Tour to help us set up benchmarks so we know what to work on when our game isn't performing up to these benchmarks. And we're going to make them so they're tough to reach. We're going to make them so they're definitely good goals, but we're also going to manage our expectations because this is golf. Golf is hard. So let's not make it any harder on ourselves, expecting ourselves to perform better than we actually can because we're not tour playing pros. We don't practice every day. Okay, cool. So with that set up, continuing on the series, today we're going to talk about approach shots to the green. We hit a tee shot, it's either going to go in the fairway, it's going to go in the rough. And so we're going to talk about approach shots from both the fairway and the rough and what we should reasonably expect by looking at the PGA Tour stats. I pulled up the stats from 2018 and that's what we're looking at. So first of all, from the fairway, and I'm only going to be looking at 100 to 125 yards. I picked this yardage because for whatever reason, people from 125 yards to 100 yards, when they don't hit it really close, they get super ticked off and frustrated. So it seemed like a good yardage to kind of manage some expectations by looking at real data. First off, the person who led the PGA Tour in 2018 on proximity to the hole from 100 to 125 yards out was Wesley Bryan. And he would hit his approach shots from that yardage to about 16 feet. That led the PGA Tour. So from 100 to 125, 16 feet, led the PGA Tour. How many of you have seen somebody you're playing with hit a ball to 30 feet from 100 yards and throw a complete tantrum? It's ridiculous. You're not going to hit it to 5 feet every time from 100 yards. So get over yourself. Throw that expectation out. It's not realistic. Nobody believes that you are used to hitting it to 5 feet every time from 100 to 125 yards. We don't believe it. You throwing a fit over it isn't convincing us. It just makes you look silly. So there you go. Very best on the PGA Tour, 16 feet. The very worst on the PGA Tour from 125 to 100 yards was Cody Gribble, and it was essentially 24 feet. That's a tour player. From 100 to 125 yards, 24 feet. So the average, we're going to go right back to our 96th place, right in the middle there, of the 193, 20 feet. Let's set up an expectation. Again, these are tour players. So we're playing to tour averages here, and I'm just going to throw this out here. 20 feet is now the goal. If you hit better than 20 feet, pat yourself on the back. You're better than the average tour pro. The tour stats are saying. Okay, so if it's somewhere between 20 and 25 feet, you're still playing within PGA Tour levels there, the average being 20. So let's be good with that. Okay, so from 100 to 125 yards from the fairway, if you hit it to 20 feet, good on you. If you hit it better than that, holy mackerel, wow, that should be an anomaly. We're amateurs. 125 to 100 feet to be outside of 20 feet. But let's say maybe inside of 30. And we should be okay with that. Okay, if it gets worse than that, okay, we got to work on our approach shots from that yardage. There you go, 20 feet, tour average. Just keep that in mind. From 100 to 125 feet, it's 20 feet. Now here's some interesting stats from that, which I thought was really interesting. The PGA Tour also gives you the conversion number. Essentially, how many under par did they go when they got it to that distance? When they hit that shot, how many times did they convert? Go under par. So Wesley Bryan, when he hit it to 15, on average to 16 feet, he made 29% of those putts, right, to go under par. John Rahm, who was at 19, the 20, John Rahm, okay, I forgot to mention that, but John Rahm was the guy that was dead in the middle to 20 feet. John Rahm, short little backswing, hits it a long way, he puts it to 20 feet. And he would convert 22% of the time from 100 yards out. Which brings up a whole nother point, right? When somebody has 100 yards out, they somehow or another believe that they should birdie that hole like 80% of the time. And that's preposterous. The very, very best on the PGA Tour, closest proximity to the hole, only converted 30% of the time. Okay, so when you're standing there and you're about ready to hit your approach shot, don't get this idea that it's a for sure birdie. Now, Cody Gribble, who was dead last, but again on the PGA Tour, he converted a birdie 10% of the time. So I would say somewhere between 10 and 20% of the time, you should expect maybe, if you're a good player, to make a birdie. That should be the benchmark. 1 to 2 out of 10, 20% of the time, 10% of the time, not 80% of the time. So again, let's manage our expectations. So for 100 to 125 yards, we're going to expect to be somewhere around 20 yards, and we're probably going to make that putt about 10% of the time. That's the expectation. Let's leave it at that. If we do better than that, great. If we do worse than that, hey, we're not tour pros. But at least we have a benchmark to see where we can work from. Let's jump now, and we're going to look at now approaches from the rough. Based on our driving numbers, we know we're going to miss about 40% of our fairways, and we're going to land in the rough. So what should our expectations be? Here's the stats. The very best from the rough from 100 to 125 yards was Lucas Glover, and he averaged 21 feet. Okay, so 6 yards more, roughly 5 plus yards more than Wesley Bryan from the fairway. And he converted birdie 10% of the times, and that led the tour. The very worst, this one was shocking. The very worst was Jason Duffner. From the rough, his proximity to the hole was 51 feet from 100 to 125 yards. 51 feet. What did that do for his conversion? That meant that 42% of the time he bogeyed. He was so far away. He did not convert. Okay, so the rough, we're starting to see kind of the difference here, right? And then we're going to go right here. It is tied for 96th, right in the middle, is Jamie Lovemark. From the rough, he was 31 feet away from the hole, from the rough, 100 to 125 yards. 31 feet. And he bogeyed 7% of the time. Okay, so overall average, he was over par when he had a shot from 100 to 125 yards from the rough. So when we hit it into the rough, those 4 times or 5 times, depending, per round, let's realize that we're probably going to make a bogey. It's very hard to hold the green, to put the ball in the right spot, you can't control the spin, and make a par or make a birdie. And I would say, probably looking at the numbers here, you got Jason Duffner bogeyed 42% of the time. There's a very good chance that we're going to bogey. Probably a 25% chance, 30% chance that we're going to bogey. And that's just the way it is. I mean, Duffner did it 42% of the time. We're amateurs. Can we say half the time we're going to bogey if we're from the rough? And then measure it from that point forward and keep track of it? Let's just realize that whatever we're averaging on the green from the fairway, we're probably going to add 10 to 15 yards to that from the rough. It's just harder to control the ball from the rough. But that's where our expectation should be. I just think it's so important when we go into 2019 and we really want to get better. And when we go out and play, if we keep our expectations so they're realistic, I think that we can enjoy the game more. And if we're enjoying the game more and really analyzing the weaknesses in our game, then we can use that time based on data to practice the stuff that we really need to practice on our limited schedule. By really focusing on where we are not performing as well as we probably should, and we could rapidly improve. Instead of going and hitting 100 balls with the driver, if we're hitting 8 to 9 fairways around, the driver's fine. But our approach shots from the fairway are 40 feet out, we should be hitting approach shots from the fairway. And if our approach shots from the fairway from the rough are 50 feet and up away from the hole, then we should probably be finding a place somewhere where we can practice shots out of the rough and work on the aspects of our game that do not hold up compared to the data. We'll just leave it at that. Let's manage expectations for 2019. So a couple cool stats that I wanted to go over, and I just picked out the same 5 players so we could kind of just have some fun with it. So from the fairway, Ricky Fowler ranked 190th out of 193, 24 feet from the hole, which I was amazed with. I really thought that he was a much better a wedge player than that. They always talk about his wedge play, and every time I've watched him, it's always been amazing. So I was surprised by that. Justin Thomas at 114th, right? Is that insane? 20 feet, right? Justin Thomas, 20 feet from the fairway. Jordan Spieth, essentially 20 feet. Tiger Woods at 26th, right? How impressive is that? For 2018, he finished 26th out of 193. Proximity to the hole, 17 feet, 11 inches. And the last one finished at number 24, Dustin Johnson, 17 feet, 10 inches away from the hole. And he converted 32% of the time from the fairway. So he would expect from 100 to 125 yards, and they've talked about immensely how he's used TrackMan to really dial in his wedges. Well, it shows here. 30% of the time from the fairway, between 100 and 125 yards, Dustin Johnson birdied. Okay, so pretty cool stat there. All right, so now from the rough. Same 5 players. Ricky Fowler was 190th from the fairway. He's 139th from the rough. So better. Okay, Justin Thomas, 3rd. He was 114th from the fairway and 3rd from the rough. Proximity is 22 feet 4 inches, and from the fairway 20 feet 2 inches. There's only 2 feet difference between the rough and the fairway. That is, wow, that's worth looking into. So you would say, hey, Justin, maybe spend more time working on, approach shots from the fairway, because the rough is pretty solid at 3rd. Jordan Spieth also plays better from the rough as a tour average than he does from the fairway. 27 feet 3 inches. Now that's 8 feet worse from the rough, but still much higher than 96th on tour. So from the rough, he actually plays quite well. Tiger Woods at 144th, 34 feet 5 inches. So Tiger Woods doesn't like the rough, and yet he's got kind of a wild driver, right, is what we found out yesterday. And then Dustin Johnson, he was tied for 34th, so still well better than average on the PGA Tour. Proximity to the hole, 27 feet 1 inch. So essentially 10 feet difference for Dustin Johnson when he's from the rough versus from the fairway. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Anyway, and Dustin Johnson still converts a birdie 6% of the time from the rough, which is a pretty good percentage. So there you go. There's the data that matters on approach shots. So let's manage our expectations, set up for a really good 2019 by remembering that when we're from the fairway, from 100 to 125 yards, we're going to be somewhere between 20 and 30 feet, and that's okay. That's tour quality playing, folks. Tour quality. If our approach shots from the fairway are landing on the green further away than 20 to 30 feet, then we know what we need to work on a little bit. That's all. Okay, from the rough, we can expect to hit our shot somewhere between 30 and 40 feet away from the hole. You can even go 30 and 50 because it's Duffner. Jason Duffner is a pretty good player. So say from 30 to 50 feet is where we would expect our approach shot to finish up, from 100 to 125 yards from the rough. And that's okay. Yeah, if it gets more than that, we can work on it. So that's how we'll manage our expectations for 2019. And we'll keep track of it and make sure that our approach shots from that range fall within these parameters. And as long as we're performing to those levels, that's not the part of our game that we're going to work on when we have time to work on it. Hopefully that's helpful. Thank you for listening. As always, better data means better golf. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Data Access Golf with Aaron Stewart. Check us out online at dataaccessgolf.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.